so fat when I got my shoes shone, I had to take the guy's word for it. I mean, I was fat. I'll tell you that. Doctors say all kinds of exercise is great. You burn up energy, you lose calories. I mean, in fact, doctors say when a man makes love to a woman, he burns up energy, he loses 150 calories. I made love to a girl once, I lost even more. I lost 150 calories, my watch, and my wallet. I mean, the last time I made love to my wife, it was ridiculous. Nothing was happening. I looked at her, I said, what's the matter? Can't you think of anyone either? Now you...
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, November the 11th, Veterans Day, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Pastor Sharp, Ayn Rand quote of the day, and Loeren Boebert, and the late 4 chapters, as a matter of fact, of The Enemies of My Country. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Thank you. So now, There's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The market makes human relations more dignified. The system of exchange, as opposed to the more aristocratic system of owner and tenant, allows even the less privileged to address society in terms of what they have to offer rather than what they need. Abject dependence upon the benevolence of others is demoralizing. Extending the rule of the market to all helps most men avoid this fate and so allows them to function as dignified equals. Yuval Levin. The way in which human dignity is respected by this process is hard to overstate. Market exchange equalizes the two parties in that they both have something to offer, and both have a need or want to be satisfied. The welfare state, a redistributionist accord, and the pre-Enlightenment feudal system all share an inferiority to the market system in that they reframe the role of one economic actor to that of a subordinate. A market economy allows for dignity and civility.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Imagine this heroic scenario. You're a reporter for a major metropolitan daily, say, the Chicago Tribune of all places, and you rise through the ranks until you become, City Hall bureau chief. Inclined to the idealistic left from birth, just for the hell of it, let's posit that you were born on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and your mother worked for a hard-left daily newspaper in Manhattan. You would naturally gravitated into journalism as an agent of social change. But now you're bored. You're interacting with DeMayor every day and seeing various wise guys what got sent by other wise guys making a fortune off the city. Realizing that politics, not journalism, is where the main chance lies, you cross the street and start working for the kinds of politicians you used to cover, eventually starting your own campaign consulting firm. After all, you got a hell of a journalistic Rolodex. And not just the politicians you covered, but those politicians who fit your idea of what a candidate should be, i.e., one who embodies the social justice ideals that you imbibed along with your mother's milk, which more or less gives the lie to your former journalistic neutrality. But so what? Now that your cards are on the table, you've got bigger fish to fry, a presidential campaign. And what do you know? After a perfect storm capsizes the other side, you're ready to make your move. You've got a candidate that a few years ago nobody ever even heard of, one whose past is completely shrouded in secrecy. Its only known facts, those the candidate himself has shared with us, in not one but two autobiographies. And so, deftly, you maneuver this candidate through the Democratic primaries, your media buddies supporting you every step of the way, never once asking a serious or pertinent question, attacking the opposition candidates, first the other progressives, then a hapless old troglodyte suffering from advanced stages of Keating 5 disease, along with delayed Stockholm syndrome, an overwhelming desire to please your media captors. And the next thing you know, it's Inauguration Day. After which, half your buddies in the media who are covering the campaign suddenly wind up with snazzy digs in the White House and the EOB, where every night they pull out the fifth of whiskey from the bottom drawers of their desks and drink a toast to Jake of sainted memory. Nah, never happen. And besides, given that I'm a Hollywood guy, the proceeding is a work of fiction and any resemblance to persons living or dead is entirely coincidental. But you see where a latter-day Jake Lingle could possibly go if he caught all the right breaks, stayed atop all the right waves, and never had to look at himself in the mirror. Throw in the exalted status reporters briefly enjoyed after Woodward and Bernstein took down Nixon, and you can understand why journalism schools enjoyed record-breaking enrollments through the 1980s and 1990s. Everybody wanted a piece of the action. We have spent years indoctrinating fine young minds at some of our best schools, creating a new social class of journalist who is so imbued with the proper way of looking at the world that he or she literally cannot see another side to the argument. which is the whole point of our educational system in the first place, to encourage correct thinking. And look at the results. We've gotten an entire generation of journalists to frame every issue through the structuralist lens of race, class, ethnicity, and gender, which is what we used to call sex, before sex became so commonplace that it's more titillating to think about having gender these days than it is to think about having sex. It doesn't matter what the news event. Once past the actual report of the event, the press can be counted on now to move the story to the next level, to interpret it in the media's own alternative universe of bias, discrimination, glass ceilings, and unicorns. Admit that you're no longer surprised when you read a headline or a chyron like this. 2 Swedes charged in plot to bomb airliner. The first you think of is a couple of big blonde guys who look like Dolph Lundgren, or maybe a guy and a gal who looks like a member of the Swedish bikini team. What you don't think of course you wouldn't, you filthy racist, are a couple of Arabs from North Africa who had been living in Sweden as asylum seekers while they merrily colluded with Al-Qaeda and surfed the jihadi beheading videos on the internet and exchanged messages of spiritual guidance and consolation with an imam in Yemen. So sensitive are the members of the American Fourth Estate to the slightest hint of racism, which, under the current definition, consists of the very act of noticing that someone is of a different race than you, that they have utterly altered what we used to consider reality.
And that was the latest installment of Chapter 11, Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 18. Circle the wagons around fellow retrogrades. Come readily to their defense when they're in trouble. This rule is the obverse of the exhortation to never frag a fellow retrograde, yet it deserves its own space on our list. While refraining from doing something negative is one thing, it's quite another to actively strive to do something positive. Affirmatively defending retrograde compatriots is necessary if we are to prevent our cause from being damaged by personal attrition at the hands of radicals. It's worth remembering that radicals selectively target the most effective and intimidating retrogrades for political hit jobs and character assassinations. They assail those whom they fear most. As such, we must have a robust system of defense in place. We must cultivate a NATO-esque, an attack on one is an attack on all mindset, a seamless entente. We must insulate each other from the smear tactics and yellow journalism so characteristically wielded by radicals. We are too few to lightly abide casualties. What does circling the wagons look like in practice? When allegations about the misconduct of a fellow retrograde are being bandied about, go to the accused directly and solicit his side of the story, his defense. If his defense, taken on its own, is adequately plausible, extend to him the benefit of the doubt. Believe him and steadfastly advocate his story before the court of public opinion if the opportunity presents itself. If no opportunity to step forward in defense of an ally manifests, then a dignified silence is acceptable, since it does no harm and still carries with it an assumption of solidarity with one's fellows. If one has no direct or conversational knowledge about the pending allegations of misconduct, but is confronted with questions about the situation, then he ought to take the defensive talking points that he has heard secondhand, and using common sense and inductive reasoning, apply them the best he can, given his limited knowledge. Where right reason allows, the retrograde must fix his will on believing allies and disbelieving enemies. All things equal, the word of a retrograde should vastly outweigh the word of a radical. We know that the man who is trustworthy in small things is also trustworthy in larger things. It stands to reason that the word of a pro-life, pro-marriage Christian man is to be believed over a godless pagan radical. It should be noted at the outset that there are exceptions to this rule. Unlike the radical, the retrograde knows he is bound by the eternal moral law and by the dictates of a well-informed conscience. He cannot blindly defend the illicit acts of his peers simply on the basis of political expediency. Such a notion should be shunned by the man of high character. As such, when a preponderance of evidence suggests that a fellow retrograde has indeed committed grave transgressions involving moral turpitude or felonious breaches of criminal law, then it is appropriate to quietly withdraw one's support for the embattled retrograde, or even discreetly counsel him to take leave of the public eye, repent of his misdeeds, and if applicable, resign his position of public trust. Unless the disgraced retrograde has given rise to a public scandal, there is no moral impetus to rebuke him publicly. Quite the opposite. When it is necessary to rebuke our allies, we should strive to rebuke them privately, away from the voyeurism and prying of the media. Do not give radicals further ammunition that they can detonate on the retrograde cause. Where only venial and superficial transgressions have been charged to a fellow retrograde, we should dedicate our communication to pointing out the absurdity of wasting time and resources hyper-scrutinizing trifles. We must also pause here for a scholium. Just because we ascertain that a retrograde ally is guilty of misconduct does not mean that we must blindly accept the sanction or redress that radicals suggest for his punishment. Just because a man stands rightly accused doesn't mean he stands rightly sentenced. Nor is it a marker of lack of humility for a wrongdoer to admit his guilt, but quibble with an undue or overly harsh chastisement. In order to maximize their political gain from the mistakes of their opponents, radicals will always press for the most draconian measures to be imposed on an errant retrograde. It is here that fellow retrogrades must instantiate the perfect nexus between justice and prudence. While allowing for and even welcoming the application of just punishment to a wrongdoer, retrogrades must never allow their shame and embarrassment to turn them into a kangaroo court that rubber stamps even the most inapt and overly harsh punitive measures. In our haste to uphold law and order, we shouldn't allow ourselves to begin prescribing the death penalty for parking violations. It is in the realm of the application of justice that mod cons falter to the highest degree. This is also where radicals make the most hay. Too often, in the wake of a scandal, mod cons are overly anxious for their political party to be out of the spotlight and to have the news cycle pivot to less humiliating fare. As such, they accept, without a fight, the unduly harsh penalties proposed by radicals more interested in making a winning political play than in seeing justice borne out. This human sacrifice, this friendly fire, must be recognized and resisted. Additionally, due to a nasty streak of superciliousness endemic to mod cons, it's not uncommon for them to openly criticize, read frag, their allies after a transgression has occurred. This sort of opportunistic virtue signaling is to be avoided at all costs. It's as if naive mod cons think that they will earn the respect of radicals by appearing sufficiently just to mete out chastisement to members of their own tribe. Clownish establishmentarians like Mitt Pierre Delecto Romney are genuinely shocked when they are calumniated by radicals when political circumstances so necessitate. E.g., in Romney's failed 2012 presidential campaign against Obama, then-Senator Harry Reid slanderously accused him of not having paid taxes for 10 years. Despite making a career out of finger-wagging at retrogrades in his own political party to the delight of progressives. Don't fall into this trap. Radicals will not hold the traitorous mod con in higher regard than the rest of his ilk. Instead, they'll happily accept the services of the useful idiot and then discard him when he has naught left to offer. Radicals, on the other hand, excel at rushing to the aid of a fellow radical in distress. They do it mechanically, automatically, without hesitating. Radicals never turned on Hillary Clinton, even in the shadow of scandals like Benghazi, Uranium One, and her email server debacle. Instead, they supported her all the more vigorously. Radicals never called for President Obama's scalp, despite his connections to scandals like Operation Fast and Furious, the weaponization of the Internal Revenue Service against conservative organizations, and his Department of Justice's wiretapping of Associated Press journalists. They supported him all the more ardently. Radicals categorically refuse to cannibalize their allies, and retrogrades should take a leaf out of their book in this regard, subject to the exceptions set forth above.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, Rule 18. And so he's all wrong about this. First of all, he should have said up front that this was a rule, and I suspect most of them, if not all the rules in this book, are geared this way, are geared to office holders and people that deal with public policy, politicians and office holders, rather than us, the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers, the rank and file individuals. And when you're talking about politics, you're no longer talking about conservatives. You're talking about Republicans versus Democrats. And he states Mitt Romney and Hillary Clinton, etc. So that's the way we know that he's not talking about conservatism or even retrograde anymore. He's talking about Republicans versus Democrats. And politics is different than culture. Culture informs our politics. We get our culture correct, the politics will take care of itself. Now, the other part of this is help. I'm under no obligation to circle the wagons around some particular so-called retrograde because they have gone out and stuck their nose where it doesn't belong, where they have gone ahead and looked for trouble. As I've said before, the true conservative doesn't look for trouble. The true conservative minds his or her own business. We help, but we help when we're asked to help, or when it's obvious that the individual in question needs help, such as my neighbor comes out of his house, staggers out onto the lawn, and then pitches over face first, and I'm in a position where I can help, and I can render first aid, I can call 911, et cetera, et cetera. That's fine. But I'm not going to go over to his house every hour, knock on the door, is everything okay in there, or peep in the windows to make sure everybody's safe and whatnot. No, I stay home, mind my own business, unless he comes over, knocks on the door, and asks me if I can provide some sort of assistance. Hey, can I borrow your lawnmower? That kind of thing. So, again, this book would have been better. All these books, the rules books, would be better if they would make the distinction between Republican and conservative, because they're not the same thing. All these people seem to think that politics informs our culture, and it's the other way around. And conservatism is an expression of culture. Republicanism is an expression of politics. So they got to get that separated. And then tell us who they're talking about. Are they talking to, as a matter of fact, who these rules are geared to? Are they geared to office holders, or are they geared to rank and file individuals? Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for patriots.
I don't base this analysis off my own opinions, but off of the data. I may be a man of faith, but analytically, I am a data-driven guy. And the data of where we are as a people is disappointing, to say the least. Look at our worldview. According to leading worldview trend analyst George Barron, only 34% of adults believe that moral truth is absolute and ethics are not situational. Just 27% of adults believe the devil is a real force of evil in the world. Didn't someone once say the devil's greatest trick was convincing mankind he didn't exist? That appears to have worked on about 3/4 of the American people, and 72% of them also believe they can earn their way to heaven by being good. And of course, the standard for good is highly subjective. This rejects the traditional Christian notion that it is by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Easter story, that we are reconciled with our Creator. Add this all up, and Barna concludes that since he started surveying American belief systems in 1995, the percentage of adults with the same basic Judeo-Christian worldview as our founding fathers has typically ranged from 7 to 9%. Yet at the same time, over 80% of Americans consider themselves to be Christians. Go figure. Now, a worldview isn't the same as a moral view. Most Americans still possess, on some level, a basic Judeo-Christian moral view, even if it's polluted in certain places by contemporary influences like moral relativism and situational ethics. Now, I would define a Judeo-Christian moral view as rightly knowing where right and wrong comes from and who the ultimate determiner of right and wrong is. A Judeo-Christian worldview is rightly integrating that knowledge of right and wrong and who we're ultimately accountable to into our daily lives so that it becomes the main influence for the decisions and choices we make. In other words, actions speak louder than words. For example, you're supporting a truly principled conservative against a Republican hack in a primary. Your guy loses said primary, and now the GOP establishment begins its sanctimonious and fingernails on a chalkboard annoying calls to coalesce because the Democrat is allegedly so much worse when, in many cases, they turn out to be one in the same. You dig in your heels and say, no way. You've read this book before, and every time you swallow your integrity and vote for the Republican, he or she then makes you regret it nearly every day they're in office. You're bound and determined you won't fall for the banana in the tailpipe anymore. But then, the Republican goes head-to-head with the Democrat, and you notice that by comparison, he's articulating a viewpoint so much closer to your own. In fact, he's starting to sound so good that now you're wondering why you raised such a stink in the primary in the first place. You start questioning yourself and wondering if the Republican Party establishment has been right about conservatives all along. Maybe we are. Impossible to please. Dadgummit, if you knew all along this guy was so good, you would have urged others to coalesce sooner to keep your powder dry for the general. You relent, and it's once more unto the breach for you. You're now all in for the Republican to beat the Democrat you believe is the clear and present danger. You're excited that your guy ends up winning on election night, and you're at the victory party. Sure, you feel a little uneasy because you're hanging out with all the people that keep giving you excuses as to why they can't do what you elected them to do, but you believe in grace and redemption after all, and who knows? Maybe they've seen the light and are finally listening to conservatives like you. However, it doesn't take long after they're sworn in for the principled rhetoric to cease and the same old to resume. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Now you're just months into the Republicans' milquetoast reign of lukewarm spit, and already you're kicking yourself, wondering why you fell for the banana in your tailpipe yet again. Especially because this time you were so sure your guy was showing real moral conviction on the campaign trail. So what happened? What happened was your friendly neighborhood Republican has a superior moral view to his Democrat opponent, or does a good job of convincing you he does. And when the moral view of the establishment Republican and the liberal Democrat were compared side by side, the establishment Republicans, while not exactly ideal, was clearly superior. However, once in office, the Republicans' moral view never transitions into a worldview. So he is either unwilling or incapable of integrating his moral view into his governing. Instead, his moral view becomes subjected to the whims of polls and avoiding conflict at all costs with those terrifying and intimidating liberal pundits who might say mean things about him. His moral view gives him the right positions, but it's his worldview that gives him the right convictions. Now, positions are negotiable based on pressures and perceptions. Convictions are non-negotiable absolutes, driven by an internal confidence that your cause is just. Thus, being criticized by the very people you're trying to defeat is a sign to you that you're on the right path. Without a proper understanding of one's place in the world and whom one is ultimately accountable to for their actions and choices while a part of it, one cannot have the right worldview.
And that was the latest installment of Chapter 3, Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Steve Deese is confused here. Republicans is about politics. That's the political angle. Conservatives are about culture. Okay, and he keeps talking politics, and he talks about Republicrats, but he doesn't talk about conservatives and liberals or conservatives and socialists. Okay, so all of this is about politics, and basically the book is addressed to office holders and other public officials, or let's say talk show hosts, addressed to his fellow talk show hosts, office holders, would-be office holders, but people in public life. And that's important to remember. And so anyways, that was Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Pastor Sharp.
I don't care where you are right now in your life. You could be in the middle of what feels like nowhere. You can be in the middle of misery. You can be in the middle of a depression. You can be in the middle of a transition. You can be in the middle of walking through an unknown season. You can be in the middle of an in-between place. Some of y'all talking about I'm broke. You better learn how to watch your words. Life and death lies in the power of your tongue. You're not broke. You in-between blessings. Some of us are in an in-between place, and because God is still God, God is like a portable charger in the middle of nowhere. God will give you what you need so you can download what you need in order to pour into other people's lives. Right there, you ought to already be thanking God, because somebody has seen God power you up in a situation where you should have been powering down.
And that was Pastor Reginald Sharp, Jr. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand quote of the day.
The whole affirmative action program is vicious. It isn't profiting anybody. It isn't improving the lot of the minorities. It is giving jobs and patronage and pull to leaders of minority groups, and observe that only the races that got themselves organized get anything out of it, if you call it an advantage. I think it's as unfair, un-American, and unjust as any current action, and I hope to God that the Supreme Court will be brave enough to forbid it once and for all in every form whatsoever. We are supposed to be colorblind, and that's what we should be.
And that was Ayn Rand's quote of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little something from Loeren, Boebert.
Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It has to be fought for and defended
by each generation. A call to action that America's sons and daughters have selflessly answered for over 2 centuries. This nation has experienced triumph and tragedy. America stands as a symbol of freedom, the stars and stripes waving proudly from every corner of this land, surpassing expectations and achieving what the world thought was impossible, proving that in this great melting pot, our differences do not divide, but allow us to unify and flourish. The very flag our hometown heroes defend has been burned, unraveled, and ripped at the seams. But every time, the American spirit comes back stronger than before. While nothing is more American than baseball or apple pie, the rights of every citizen has to ensure their voice is heard is what truly makes America's stars shine. We have had disagreements, but this land has benefited from the change every new generation has brought. America was built on the rule of law, a privilege that would not be possible without their noble sacrifice. Since the Revolution, America's bravest have put themselves in danger, whether that be at home or abroad. Our freedom of expression has remained alive and well for those who put their lives on hold to ensure we can peacefully pursue our own happiness. Every American is forever indebted to our service members. This Veterans Day, to anyone who has ever worn the uniform proudly, thank you. I will always be grateful and pray for you and your family, and of course, your safe return home. Thank you so much for your service. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
And that was Loeren Boebert. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, another chapter of The Enemies of My Country.
11. Duchess focused on the central flat screen, projecting a grainy, low-angle shot of the target building from the unarmed UAV flying its orbit. It was impossible to tell what was going on inside the building. They were reliant on David's communications for that. But the situation outside the structure complicated itself with the sudden appearance of two covered flatbed trucks turning onto the street. The UAV controller said, "2 trucks leaving the objective, headed northbound. Do you want me to follow them or keep eyes on the target area for the ground team?" Duchess answered without hesitation, "Stay with the trucks. J2, I want a geofix on the phone that Barry Khan called in Zaranj." "Working it now," the J2 called back. Duchess had promised herself she'd never be the person in an air-conditioned OPSIN pestering the ground force commander for updates. After all, a significant portion of the GFC's job was keeping the higher command appraised with timely updates on the tactical situation. But it took David over a minute to check in, and when his voice came over the satellite communications relay, it was garbled amid intermittent static. "Bravo 4. No joy. 8 EKIA. 2 flatbed trucks fled. Heading north. Airstrike." Then the words faded to static altogether, before ultimately cutting to silence. But she'd heard enough. Bravo 4 meant they were diverting to an alternate exfil point. No joy meant BK was alive, and his team had claimed 8 enemy killed in action, which was notable for the same reason the 2 flatbed trucks were. Namely, what in the hell were those transport vehicles and that many people doing at a supposed bed-down site? Duchess's worst fears were coming true. Her suspicion that the only plausible answer was a repeat of what she'd encountered long ago in Yemen, which would explain his use of the one word that should never have come over the radio frequency during a covert assassination: airstrike. She keyed her hand mic. "Suicide, you're coming in broken. Say again." "Stand by. To high ground. When able, get an airstrike inbound. Flatbeds headed north." The only explanation was that David wasn't concerned with BK himself, but rather the cargo aboard the trucks. Without further information forthcoming until David reached the high ground to send a clear transmission, she needed more of the one thing she was losing by the second: time. "What's our UAV station time?" The operator called back. 37 minutes before bingo fuel, but if those trucks keep going at max speed, we'll lose visual before that. Nearest airstrike capability?" This time, her joint terminal air controller answered. 2 F-15Es are on ready status, 1 at Incirlik. If we scramble them now, they could be putting down munitions in just over 2 hours. "JTAC, what's the fastest we can reacquire visual?" A man responded, "The next wave of UAVs will be overhead in approximately 1 hour, 42 minutes. So no matter what happened, she was going to lose eyes on the 2 flatbeds for just over an hour. And she had the creeping suspicion they'd just stumbled onto something much bigger. Duchess checked her watch. Gosweiler would be stepping out of his Senate prayer breakfast in less than 10 minutes, after which he'd be en route to the OPSIN, at best, and be able to shut her down completely at worst. Now she faced the quandary of whether to trust her ground force commander and marshal additional assets that would likely expose a targeted killing operation that was supposed to be known only to a handful of Washington elites. After a second of thought, she made her announcement. I'm calling in agency authorization. Get those F-15s inbound now. 12. Ian struggled up the rocky slope, keeping Worthy in sight through his night vision as they moved in single file. They were racing against time, moving quickly toward the crest's high ground, where David could make effective radio contact with Duchess. From there, the team would swing south for 300 meters to their alternate exfil point. David fell in alongside Ian, whispering as they moved, "There must have been a dozen crates in there. 13. And that's not the worst." David cut him off. "This is big. Those rockets were military grade. We've just stumbled upon hard evidence of state-sponsored terrorism. This has to be Iran. David, it's, or maybe," David continued, "Russia. Using the serial numbers, Duchess should be able to trace the equipment." "David, shut up. This is the result of state sponsorship. By us." "What do you mean, by us?" Panting for breath as he moved, Ian replied, "Those were Bulgarian-made OG-9 VM-1 rockets. The CIA supplied them to the Syrian resistance. One of the shipments was lost in an ambush 6 months ago. 13 crates totaling 650 rockets, and has been missing ever since. The agency assumed that load had since been fired all over Syria, but we just found it intact. And since we only destroyed 4, that means 645 are still at large. 646, Ian corrected him, but that's not the point. This means BK was sent here to take possession of the rockets, and that wouldn't be the case unless he'd been hand-picked to lead a major terrorist operation. With that payload, he could wipe a few city blocks off the map." David continued huffing uphill for a moment before asking, "What do you think he's after? One of our bases in Syria, maybe? Or a U.S. embassy somewhere? Could be anything. Duchess needs to hit those trucks ASAP." As Worthy crested the high ground, Ian heard David transmitting beside him. "Raptor 9-1, this is Suicide Actual. How copy?" Duchess's response was faint over Ian's earpiece. "You're coming in clear," she said. "Send it. Those 2 flatbeds have the missing shipment of rockets intended for the Syrian resistance." "OG-9 VM-1, Ian prompted him. David said, "OG-9 VM-1, 645 are at large." Ian cringed. 646, David? "Correction," he continued. 646 rockets at large and presumed to be on the trucks along with BK. Assess they will be used in a major attack. Need airstrike on those 2 flatbeds ASAP. How copy?" "It's in the works," she replied. "You're sure you found the entire load?" Ian whispered, "We're sure. They shipped 50 to a crate, and we found 13 crates. You can double-check my math later." David transmitted, "Positive. All crates accounted for. We'll send serial numbers when able." An explosion in the village cut his transmission short. The team fell into the prone, Ian the last to hit the ground. Orienting his weapon toward the noise, he caught a brief glimpse of a fireball ascending over the rooftops before fading to black, leaving only an ashy green smear of smoke visible in his night vision. There was a brief chatter of gunfire before he heard the revving of vehicle engines. Ian asked, "What the hell was that?" It was Cancer who replied, having assessed the situation at the first blast. "A suicide," he transmitted in an excited tone as if he were pleasantly surprised, if not enthusiastic about what had just occurred. "I think that was our exfil vehicle." 13. Joanne watched the scene in the Alpsin unfold with a rapidity she'd witnessed all too many times. Duchess thought her to be a dumb country bumpkin, she supposed, and Joanne didn't particularly care. All that mattered was that the job got done. The problem, up until this point, was that it hadn't. And she knew as well as Duchess did that things were about to get a lot worse for everyone in the Opsin, for the ground team, and for the future of Project Longwing. The UAV rep called out, Trucks are headed northbound toward Deshar, where the road diverges northwest and northeast. UAV will lose them before they get there. It's going offline in 15 minutes. Without prompting, the Joint Terminal Air Controller announced, "Our three-bird ISR stack will arrive 24 minutes ahead of the fighters, and I have recommended priorities for all three." Duchess replied, "First platform on station goes to the center point of Deshar and flies concentric rings outward to search for the trucks first, and evidence of rocket transfer second. The next two proceed up the northeast and northwest routes to locate the trucks, and once they're found, I want a full speed and distance analysis to determine if they had time to hand off cargo. Am I missing anything?" "No, ma'am. I'm on it." Joanne felt herself nodding at Duchess's order, grateful that she didn't have to intervene. It wasn't her role to bark orders, and interrupting Duchess was the last thing she wanted to do. Instead, Joanne monitored the exchanges in the OPSIN with a clinical focus, trying to divine any vital information that had slipped through the cracks. Because while Duchess was ultimately in charge, Joanne was able to maintain an objectivity and perspective denied to anyone who had to answer the radio calls the instant they were received. And her first opportunity to contribute came with the J2's next update. "We've identified the location of BK's outgoing call," he said. "Geofix is on a structure on the east side of Zaranj, probable residence of a suspected ISIS logistician. It's a 12-kilometer straight-line distance from the target building where BK scrapped his phone." Joanne was already typing into the encrypted chat on her computer, linked directly to a counterpart at the JSOC OPSIN. Duchess said, "I need to know what strike assets on it," Joanne replied, focusing on the response appearing on her screen. Looking up, she said, "There's a strike force at Forward Operating Base Presley, a platoon of Rangers, and 2 CAG troops." No one called them CAG anymore outside of the old breed who predated the myriad code name changes in the interim. But Duchess knew exactly who Joanne was referring to, an organization so elite that the military simply referred to them as the unit, and well-informed civilians called Delta Force, the Army's equivalent of SEAL Team 6, established 3 years prior to their Navy counterparts. Aside from a few areas of specialization, there was virtually no difference between the two. Both were the apex predators of special operations, and either could accomplish their missions with a precision unknown to virtually any other military organization worldwide. As Joanne saw the next line of text appear in her encrypted chat, she said, "They could be wheels down in Zaranj in just over 6 hours." Duchess winced at the ETAs, and for good reason. Far too much could happen in that period of time. "Put the Rangers on standby for a bomb damage assessment once we hit the trucks. I'll need a helicopter to recover our ground team, and I want the CAG troops on standby for no-notice launch in support of emerging intelligence as it is obtained. Questions?" Joanne typed a swift response and said, "In the works." Then the J2 said, "Intercepted radio chatter indicates an ISIS convoy was on its way to escort the flatbeds when they encountered a civilian truck on the road and what? They destroyed it. What are the odds that it wasn't our team's exfil vehicle? At 0130 Syrian time? Close to 0. David transmitted, "Raptor 9-1, be advised we just saw a fireball in the village and our exfil driver is no longer responding." Duchess snatched up the mic. "We're tracking. You'll have to initiate your escape and evasion plan until we can redirect recovery assets your way. What's the status on that airstrike?" "It's inbound." "Are you going to have continuous eyes on the trucks?" "There's going to be a gap in coverage." "Copy. Stand by for Angel." Duchess frowned. Angel was the call sign for the team's intelligence operative, Ian. Joanne hadn't met him, but knew him by family reputation. His father was a special operations legend whose exploits for the military and the agency had become canon among the community. Even the SEAL Team 6 operators Joanne had worked with spoke Mad Dog Greenberg's name with awe. Ian transmitted, "By all means hit the trucks, but don't be surprised when your bomb damage assessment doesn't find any rocket remains. BK's too smart to leave his cargo in those trucks for long, and we can't afford to lose them. They can fly nearly 3 miles, have a blast radius of 10 meters, and there's over 600 of them. You do the math, and if they've sat on those rockets for months, it means there's something big in the works. A catastrophic attack they've been setting up." "No shit," Joanne muttered to herself. Duchess was only slightly more diplomatic in her response. Tell us something we don't know. The next transmission came not from Ian, but David. So tell us how to help. We don't need to evade. We need to stay on the trail. Duchess looked over to Joanne then, her eyes conveying what she likely had too much pride to speak. A search for confirmation, a second opinion on how she was about to respond. Joanne, for her part, had been waiting for the chance. This wasn't the first time she'd seen a mission's single purpose fragment into a constellation of unanticipated contingencies. Though she had to admit, the wheels were coming off this particular operation with an intensity that rivaled anything she'd seen. They had 2 trucks on the move, with Bari Khan presumably aboard, a dearth of air support, and a suspected logistician with potentially critical intelligence 12 kilometers from the objective, where the ground team was now stranded. So when Duchess looked to her, Joanne was waiting with a thumbs-up gesture, nodding as she said, "We have nothing to lose by telling them." Joanne's thinking in that moment wasn't that the ground team would have some miraculous ability to intervene, but in her years of working first with SEALs and then with the greater Special Operations community, she'd learned that a fully informed ground team could generate solutions that not even a full OPSIN staff would have the first-hand perspective to see. Whether or not Duchess had been seeking confirmation for her decision, Joanne couldn't tell, but a moment later she transmitted her reply. BK placed a call requesting an armed escort for the cargo. We think the call was made to a logistician who brokered the transport, and we've located the call's point of origin in Zaranj. But that's over 12 kilometers from your team, and you're not going to make it there before sunrise. We can have a special operations team there to snatch him in 6 hours. In 6 hours, this logistician is going to be gone. Keep tracking his phone and send us the grid. You're isolated without support, Duchess replied. What can you possibly accomplish? A long silence followed, and the next transmission carried with it a tone of smug confidence that made Joanne crack a grin. Duchess, David said, you're lucky you have us. 14. I activated my rifle-mounted laser, the infrared floodlight illuminating the house interior in blazing emerald hues as I moved toward the stairs. This was no explosive breach, but a surreptitious entry. Riley had pried open a door to let us in, and we spread throughout the small building as stealthily as we could manage. The house was dead silent, and I wondered how anyone could sleep at the moment. We'd been in a gunfight not far from here about an hour earlier, and that was before our exfil truck turned into a fireball. Yet I supposed if you lived in a war zone, there wasn't much choice. And when I thought about it, I'd had deployments where nighttime rocket attacks, even those that didn't miss my sleeping quarters by much, had been followed by going back to sleep in short order. I ascended the stairs and paused at a doorway, feeling Ian squeeze my shoulder from behind. Pushing open the door, I slipped inside and saw 2 figures in the bed, a man and a woman. I paused for a moment. There were 10 different ways this could turn out, and 9 of them were bad. The woman's hair was a dark tangle over her pillow as she slept on her stomach. The man was on his side, facing away from me, and this was going to be really embarrassing, I thought, if he wasn't who I thought he was. Circling to the opposite side of the bed, I found an AK-47 leaning barrel up against the wall. I took the weapon in one hand and noiselessly passed it to Ian. Then, kneeling beside the man, I examined his face. His features were lean and angular, ending in a neatly trimmed beard that left no doubt. This was the father whose daughter I'd saved during our previous incursion to Syria. I'd been in this home once before, glimpsing BK through the ground floor window shortly before handing the little girl back to the man I knelt before. And here's where it got tricky, I thought. A surreptitious entry was no problem for my team, nor in fact was a gunfight. But there was no easy way to do what I was about to do. Using a red penlight, I illuminated my face from below and shook the man awake. "Shh," I whispered, then summoned the most appropriate of my limited Arabic phrases. "Khatahi lasat bimushkula." This is not a problem. The man's face was calm as his eyelids fluttered open, and he seemed to register my presence with a serene acceptance. That was easier than I thought. Then, as he awoke more fully, his eyes went wide and he screamed. "Shh," I repeated more urgently. But he screamed even louder. His cries were soon drowned out by his wife, who bolted upright and began shrieking loud enough to crack a window pane. Shit, I thought. This was going poorly. I stood and turned on my tack light, pointing the beam downward to cast a soft glow and let them see us in full. "It's okay," I said as reassuringly as I could manage, tapping my chest. "Sadiq, Sadiq, friend." I held my hand toward him and said, "Sadiqi," for my friend. The woman was clutching a sheet to her chest, her figure partially covered by the man as he tried to shield her from harm. They both looked terrified, the man in particular as he recognized me. He seemed to think this was some form of retribution, maybe us coming back to eliminate eyewitnesses to our previous operation. I heard a girl scream from down the hall, followed by Riley whispering in a failed bid to calm her. Looking to the woman, I extended an arm toward the door and said, "Please, Raja." She hesitated and I told Ian to look away. Only then did she rise from the bed, sweeping out of the room as I transmitted, "Mom is inbound." The man, sitting up to find that his AK-47 was gone from the bedside, gave me a smoldering glare. "Ana Asif," I said. "I'm sorry. Walakin intaj, but I need..." Wait, I corrected myself. "Nuntaj musayada. We need your help." Had I said that right? I thought so and waited for his reaction. He shook his head slightly. "Your Arabic is terrible." "Look," I said, transitioning to English, "your family is safe. You remember me, right? I saved your daughter." He shot back, "You started a battle? You almost got her killed." "Well, yeah, but then I saved her. I assume you also started the battle earlier tonight?" I shrugged. "Yeah, maybe." "What do you want?" I glanced at Ian, who looked even more uncomfortable than I felt. Then I replied, "I need you to take us to Zaranj. You know this place?" "Of course I know it." "What do you want there?" "There's a man I need to question. I'm not sure if he speaks English and, well, you heard my Arabic." "I have heard your attempt at Arabic." "So it's settled," Ian said cheerfully. "You drive us there, help us get some information, and we part ways. Oh, and maybe we could borrow some of your clothes because, we're all pretty white." I added, "We can pay you." The man was unconvinced. "You cannot pay me enough? Zaranj is not for tourists. If they identify my vehicle, they will kill me." He rubbed his forehead, then stopped abruptly as he looked to me with renewed interest. "But if you can get my family to America, perhaps I can help." I hesitated. I'd never discussed this prospect with Duchess, and while I was certain the CIA had the resources to relocate a family, I'd never explicitly received permission to offer them. Clemency to sympathetic locals hadn't exactly been a planning consideration prior to our freefall into Syria. 3 people, I said. You, your wife, and your daughter. 4. My mother as well. Shit. Duchess was going to be pissed. I will request permission for 4 people. Seeing his gaze harden, I added, and no matter the response, I will personally ensure you make it to America. I'll set it up myself if I have to. I pulled the tactical glove off my right hand, extending a sweaty palm toward him. He rose from the bed and shook my hand. Nizar. David. Releasing the handshake, I said, I'm sorry to be in a hurry, Nizar, but the sun will rise soon and we need to leave immediately. Not yet. He shook his head. First, you need to meet my mechanic.
And that was chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.